Hello everyone. Well, I finally got around to it after promising for years that I was going to start making some short videos, and this is the first of what I hope will be a series of short videos which will concentrate mainly on my materials and some tips and hints and skills that you will need to improve in your watercolour painting. I want you all to remember that these are just my opinions. They're opinions that I've based on 20 odd years of learning to paint, and I say learning because I'm still learning to paint. So please don't feel that these have to be exactly what you follow, but there are always reasons why I choose what I choose, and I hope to describe those as we go on with this series of short videos. So the first thing today that I wanted to chat to you about is paper. And the reason I've chosen paper to chat to you about first is because, in my opinion, paper is the most important thing to get right with watercolour painting. And I know when I first started out, paper was a really difficult thing because I hadn't a clue what all the terms meant. I didn't have any idea what cold press meant, what rough paper meant, what sizing was. I just had no idea about any of it. So I thought I would just break all that down for you. And actually I get these packs which you can see here, and one of the main manufacturers in the UK is called St Cuthbert's Mill, and they send these packs out, and they'll send them out to anybody really, for people to try them. So you can see they're small sizes, and you've got Bockingford and Milford on that side, and on this side they send out Saunders Waterford, and they're all 300 grams or £140, and they've sent a selection. They have a selection in these packs of hot pressed, cold pressed and rough. So I'll just open this up for you now, and then you can perhaps see them a little bit closer up, and then you will perhaps end up with a little bit better idea. Now, Bockingford is the paper I use with my students, and I find it a very forgiving paper. I do prefer the rough texture, which I'll go on to explain a little about later. So that's the rough one. If I hold that up a bit closer, can you see the texture? It's quite a lot of texture, but it's a very even texture because this is a machine-made paper. It's not a handmade one. And it's made from a chemical pulp. The other side is very similar. There may be a slight difference, but I never differentiate when I'm painting with it. So that's the rough paper. This is the cold pressed. Now, cold pressed, what cold pressed means is not hot pressed, and it's cold pressed. Can you see it says not there? So you can use either term. Cold pressed or not is the same paper. That was something I really got confused with. I didn't realise that they were the same. And finally, this is the smooth. So can you see that it's really very different? You compare them all together. Can you see the texture there? Now, the difference and why you would choose one over the other, a lot of people get confused about that, and I certainly used to buy any paper that was on offer or anything that looked good buy, not realising which paper might suit my way of painting the best. Now, the smooth paper is far better for painting detail with. So any of you who've seen my work will know I'm not a detailed painter. So it really doesn't suit the way I paint, and I find it really quite difficult to paint with. The paint stays on the surface of the paper, it doesn't soak in at all, and I find it really quite difficult to mix the colours on smooth paper. The intermediate, so the cold pressed or not paper there, is a good halfway house, and a lot of students really like to try using this first, because it has that little bit of texture, but it's quite forgiving and it's not too difficult to handle. Sometimes people find the very rough texture there a little bit more difficult to handle. What happens with these papers is that the water sits in the valleys of the paper, and it allows you to work with it for much longer. Whereas with smooth paper or hot press paper, it dries very quickly and you get edges forming where you might not want edges. You have to have eyes all over the painting watching for the edges to form. Now, hard edges are fine when you want them, but they're quite difficult to get away or remove when you don't want them. So that's why I prefer working with a rough paper. And I just prefer the look of it with the texture showing through underneath. St Cuthbert's Mill also make Saunders. Now, Saunders paper is a beautiful paper. Again, they make it in a hot pressed, which is their smooth. It says on their new improved smoother surface, so it feels lovely, but it's not for me to paint on. And there is their cold pressed or knot paper. So I think you can see the texture on that. And that is the rough. So it looks slightly rougher, doesn't it, than the Bockingford? If you look at them both together, it looks even rougher. So I really like that paper. Bockingford is very, very forgiving. And what I mean by that is that if you find that you want to lift any edges out of the Bockingford at any point in time, it is quite easy to lift the paint, even if it's a fairly staining paint. Saunders, it's not quite as easy to lift from, but you can always use more of an acrylic brush once it's dry, and you can loosen the edges with Saunders as well. I was just going to show you how the paper behaves when you put paint on, and you'll see quite a difference then certainly with the textured ones compared to the smooth. So if I just add a little bit of paint onto here, I don't know whether you can see the colours. This is the first time I've ever set this up, so I don't know how clear it's all going to be for you. So that looks very different to me, certainly. I don't know if you can see that. And then let's put the rough. So the smooth, the edges are drying already. I can see that they're drying. The rough, the cold press there, some of the edges are drying, but not. I can see that the paint's granulating into the paper, which again is an effect that you will get with a rougher paper rather than a smooth. Even with a very granulating paint, you won't get as much granulation on smooth because there's nowhere for the paint to go and sit and separate. The reason that I wanted to talk about paper first is that when you are painting with watercolour, you need to choose paper which is fit for purpose. And when I say fit for purpose, watercolour paper has been manufactured specifically to take watercolour. It's been sized correctly, and it is something that you really, really need to learn about and to think about when you buy your paper. Watercolour painting's hard enough to do without having to fight the paper as well. Now, many artists will tell you that maybe brushes are more important and maybe paint is more important. But certainly if you're a beginner, as I go around to workshops and visit different art groups, as beginners, the thing that makes the most difference to the look of their work is the paper that they're using. And a lot of people think that it's best to practice on an inferior quality paper. And what that practice will do, it will teach you how to paint on an inferior quality to paper. It won't tell you how to practice on a better quality paper. And that's what you need to do. If you aspire to paint on good paper, then ultimately you need to practice on paper which is fit for purpose. And if you change papers, then you need to practice on the new paper. You need to get used to it. You need to get a feel for how the paint and the water sit on the surface of the paper. and it might take you many paintings to get used to a new paper. So the thing that you have to do is buy a paper, and the one that you think you may like, and stick with it for a little while and work with it and see whether you like it. The choice of the texture that you would use would be very much determined on the type of painting you do, but a lot of people really just go for the cold pressed, which is the intermediate one. And with cold press you get the best of both worlds. It's not too difficult to handle. With a rough paper, if your brush isn't terribly wet or not wet enough, then what can happen is you can actually you can miss the paper. Can you see that? So that's a dry brush technique. Now on a smooth paper, that doesn't happen, and on a cold press paper it doesn't happen quite as much. You see that? So you can see the difference there, can't you? There's a lot more texture there. When you do a dry brush technique like that, what it means is that the paint is just touching the hills of the paper. It isn't touching the valleys. So that's one of the differences, and that's why some people might find it more difficult to handle, because you will get this bright dry brush technique happening if your paint isn't wet enough. But that's a technique that you can also use to its advantage when you're actually painting. So any questions, please let me know, and I'll try and explain a little bit more. But do consider buying a decent quality paper, because if you practice on poor paper, then it teaches you nothing about practicing on a better paper, and ultimately you will want to paint on better paper. So that's the first one. I hope it's been informative. Do let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about the setup, because it's the first time I've used all this equipment. And I'll see you on the next one. Bye.